Going to turn off my mic and camera.
You guys can go ahead and start whenever you like.
All right. Yes, I like that, Matt Taylor. Let's get hyped for this. So welcome everybody to the 2022 Great Decisions Speaker Series. This is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Association, sponsored locally by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis and UMSL Global, the international office at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. UMSL Global has been a partner and sponsor of this speaker series for many years, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. The World Affairs Council is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with local chapters across the United States. It's a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization that connects the citizens of the St. Louis region to the world. Founded in 1948, their mission is to offer programs which promote understanding, engagement, relationships, and leadership in world affairs. They rely on donations from the community and have annual memberships available. So if you take a look at the chat, you can learn more about the World Affairs Council and UMSL Global through those links. So hello, everyone. My name is Anita Mannion, and I'm an assistant professor in political science at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. I'm also a presidential engagement fellow for the UM system and a political analyst for our local NBC affiliate. And I will be your moderator today. So before we get started, just a quick note about how this will work. Dr. Stephen Bagwell will give his talk and answer questions after the talk, but you are welcome to drop your questions into the Q&A at any time as we go, and we'll field those when the talk is over. Please welcome Dr. Stephen Bagwell. Stephen is an assistant professor in political science department at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His teaching and research focus on the causes and consequences of violent political behavior and respect for human rights. His work has appeared in the Journal of Global Security Studies, the Journal of Human Rights, Political Violence at a Glance, and The Conversation. So join me in giving Stephen a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And again, just want to echo the thanks to UMSL Global, the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, and the Foreign Policy Association for giving me a platform to talk about a really important and very lengthy ongoing issue that really has not received enough global attention. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Myanmar and the prospects for peace there, the end of the genocide, the prospects for democratization broadly. As an apology at the start, which is a great way to start every presentation, I'm a scholar of political violence and human rights, democratization, and development broadly. I am not a case expert or a Southeast Asia expert. So my approach when I was asked to do this was going to be sort of, let's look at sort of broad trends and see how those apply specifically to the situation in Myanmar. What can the scholarly literature about coups and democratization and human rights and genocide tell us specifically about this situation? So that's the approach that I've taken. That comes a little bit at the expense of specific knowledge of the case, but just wanted to make sure everybody was going to be on the same page with what to expect so that you're not horribly disappointed by the end. Having said all that, I'm going to move on and let's talk about the bottom line up front. Give you some spoilers. The Rohingya ethnic group have been excluded and persecuted throughout Myanmar's history. It rose to the level of a genocide really only in the past little over a decade. Any prospects for a peaceful and functioning democracy are going to begin with ending the world's longest running civil war, ending the genocide, establishing civilian control over the military. But a little bit of a downer on this. Both of those things are difficult to see happening in the short term. Right now, most of the world's attention is devoted to Russia and Ukraine. And while the world is certainly capable of achieving multiple foreign policy goals at the same time, they don't seem to be particularly willing to allocate all those resources in multiple different avenues. Having said that, even if Myanmar was gaining the attention that Russia and Ukraine was, there are very few ties with pro-democracy regimes, which really sort of undercuts any push for democratization. Beyond that, the military has been very politically active, and so it's going to be very difficult to rein the military in now that there's this sort of culture and deep, deep history of the military being very engaged in politics. But let's move on from this and get some historical context and maybe a shared understanding of why I'm coming to those conclusions. Just sort of an overview. Going to provide some historical context, going to talk about democratization and the series of coups that have taken place in Myanmar. Going to talk about the junta and what we know about elections broadly, and talk about the role of the Association for Southeast Asian Nations and neighboring countries as well. Myanmar gained independence following World War II and then began the world's longest running civil war 4 months later. There are, if I remember correctly, over 100 different ethnic groups, many of them with armed insurgent groups that are affiliated with them, that have been at varying degrees of civil war with each other and with the state apparatus, basically since Myanmar's post-colonial independence. The first military coup occurred in 1962 and established the first military junta in Myanmar. It ruled until 1988, when massive protests all around the country led General Ne Win to allow a referendum. This referendum took place and overwhelmingly was in favor of creating a multi-party parliamentary democracy. This came to pass and existed for a couple of months, and then until a second coup occurred in September of 1988, which then established the State Law and Order Restoration Council, a military junta that immediately cracked down on all those protesters that were still out in the streets trying to, support this fledgling democracy, killing over 3,000 people. But at the same time, it also led to ceasefire agreements with several insurgent groups. So even while repressing their own people, they managed to sort of start to alleviate some of the problems of the massive civil wars that were happening. Elections were then held again 2 years later in 1990, but the junta did not recognize the results of those elections. This ultimately is going to be sort of a recurring theme where if the party that the military doesn't support wins, the military screams election fraud, or it's not worth recognizing the results. Still, though, this led to the elimination of the State Law and Order Restoration Council and was replaced with the State Peace and Development Council. This nominally was an improvement, but in terms of actual changes on the ground, not a great change. Still, various ethnic minority groups, including the Rohingya, were systematically excluded from the political, legal, and economic system. I'm going to talk now a little bit more about the genocide against the Rohingya people. So this began as communitarian violence, but was supported by local police and armed forces. Communitarian violence is something that's short of civil war or a full-out, insurgent battle, army versus army. It's really more mob violence generally, but that it was supported by local police and the armed forces kind of makes it even more problematic. So this communitarian violence ultimately rose to the level of a genocide. And the way this violence started was the ethnic Rakhine in Rakhine state were sort of gradually over time radicalized to hate the ethnic Rohingya, the Muslim ethnic group. So predominantly Buddhist ethnic group against a predominantly Muslim ethnic group. They were sort of taught that there was a great replacement taking place where there were pamphlets distributed that said the Rohingya are multiplying, they're basically replacing us, they are taking our jobs, they are taking our role in society, and we should be threatened by this. And ultimately, over time, that led to this feeling of threat and the communitarian violence that I mentioned here. This initial communitarian violence immediately led to hundreds of thousands of refugees, both internally displaced persons and external, predominantly going to Bangladesh or trying to escape across the sea to Malaysia. The junta created dozens of concentration camps, both for the ethnic Rakhine group and the Rohingya. Basically, not to make too much light of the situation, but put both of them in timeout. And gradually, the plan seemed to be over time to let everybody out and just wait until tensions cooled, let people back out and return to their homes. What happened is the ethnic Rakhine were allowed to return to their homes. The ethnic Rohingya were not. These concentration camps were built to last 2 years. They are now over a decade old. They have been largely destroyed by successive monsoon seasons. They are in really, really bad shape. Some reports by Human Rights Watch and other reputable international organizations, aid workers have pointed out that the sewage from these camps is separated by basically a hill of mud, a very small hill of mud from the drinking water. So very, very bad conditions for people. They are systematically denied access to healthcare. The ratio of doctors to individuals in these concentration camps are something like 6,000 to 1, whereas in Myanmar broadly, the ratio is significantly lower than that. And then I've got some numbers here that I pulled out in camps just in central Rakhine State. 85,000 out of 120,000 school-age Muslim children are out of school entirely. And the only high school has a 100 to 1 student-to-teacher ratio. In one camp, only 3% of women are literate, and that is fairly representative of the state of people in these concentration camps broadly. This creates both short-term and long-term problems. Even if the genocide ended tomorrow and these camps were closed down and the Rohingya were allowed to peacefully reintegrate into society, we're talking about now an entire generation of people that are significantly behind the curve when it comes to education, which is going to systematically deny them economic opportunities, even if they were able to peacefully reintegrate. In 2017, following a little bit of international pressure, the government announced a plan to close these camps, but the way that they are closing these camps is not about peaceful reintegration, it's about building more permanent concentration camps that are designed to permanently segregate the Rohingya ethnic group. So we've got sort of this common background of what's going on. Let's talk a little bit about what we know about democratization and coups broadly, and coups and peace and human rights, and whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. There are some studies that show when there is a lot of violence happening in a society, sometimes a coup can limit that violence. That has been less true for coups in the past 20 years. Coups are generally bad for respect for human rights. Some ways of preventing coups and promoting democratization are to ensure that different ethnic groups are well represented in your military, because then they are more likely to identify with the Constitution than potential leaders and prevent their military leaders from extending their tenure in office through unconstitutional means. And then we also know that international organizations' responses to coups can decrease the duration of the post-coup government. Usually it's a military junta. Importantly here, if international organizations and other individual states both sort of condemn the coup and respond in a hostile but not necessarily aggressive way, it can decrease the duration of the post-coup government by up to 7 months. The average post-coup government lasts about 3 years, so that's a pretty substantial amount of time. In Myanmar, the duration of coups, post-coup governments has tended to last quite a bit longer. We'll see how long the junta wants to remain in power before allowing more elections this time. We also know that coups are often followed by elections. One of the ways military leaders try to establish legitimacy after undertaking a coup is by having elections that are usually not very free or very fair. The military's party or preferred candidates almost always win. And this is sort of a way to legitimize the actions that the military has taken sort of post hoc. The other way is by gaining legitimacy to the international system, which I'll talk about more in a minute. I mentioned earlier that the prospects for democratization were not great in Myanmar. Part of that is because they are highly integrated with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and you can see sort of this list of member states that are predominantly not democratic and have several of them a long history of experiencing coups themselves. On top of this, I mentioned that most of the violence in Myanmar was being perpetrated by Buddhists against an ethnic Muslim minority. Different countries like Malaysia are predominantly Muslim. Some countries like Thailand are predominantly Buddhist and also have a sizable Muslim minority population. And so there are, on top of ideological or pro-democracy versus authoritarian cleavages in this alliance, there are also ethnic cleavages that are preventing this organization from acting as a unitary actor and applying pressure to Myanmar. What I have here is a map taken from the Varieties of Democracy project, which shows the Electoral Democracy Index for 2021. A score of 1 represents a total electoral democracy. A score of 0 represents no democracy. For comparison's sake, China scores a 0.08, Myanmar scores a 0.13, Thailand scores a 0.2, Indonesia, probably the most democratic government of ASEAN, scores a 0.58, and Malaysia scores a 0.41. So just for comparison, you can see sort of many of these alliance members are not going to make a strong push for democratization because they themselves are not democracy, and it would probably undercut their own legitimacy if they were saying you need to democratize because that's the best form of government or the most legitimate form of government when they themselves are not democracies. ASEAN has identified several strategic priorities. These are major historical initiatives in terms of economic integration, security, cooperation, and human development. The AEC, or the ASEAN Economic Community, envisions ASEAN as a single market fully integrated with the global economy. So the goal is to sort of look economically like the European Union, continue to integrate over time with each other, and then serve as a very powerful bloc in the global economy. The APSC, or the ASEAN Political Security Community, envisions the region living at peace with one another and with the world in a democratic and harmonious environment. What democracy looks like to them, given that this is one of their core values, I think it's fair to question. And then the ASCC, the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community, envisions the region as an inclusive community that promotes high quality of life, equitable access, and promotes and protects human rights. Again, given sort of what we know about democratization, freedom of association, freedom of political participation, the right to not be tortured, and a number of other things that occur in the region, it's, I think, fair to question which human rights they're going to value and what they are actively doing to promote these values. In terms of how ASEAN is reacting to the problems in Myanmar, the coup and the genocide specifically, they're largely shirking the problem. They were very slow to react. Thailand in particular is probably somewhat complicit. Again, it's predominantly governed by a Buddhist majority that has no real incentive to either democratize Myanmar or sort of stop the Buddhist majority in Myanmar from attacking Muslim civilians. There have been concentration camps set up in Thailand by human traffickers under the guise of helping refugees escape to Malaysia and cross the sea to Malaysia, or get to other Muslim majority countries in the region where they would feel safer. I think it's worth noting that the situation is so bad in Myanmar that even though the Rohingya know that these camps are set up, they are likely to be ransomed as a best case scenario and live in really squalid conditions in these smuggler-run concentration camps. They are still willing to leave and risk it. I think that really speaks to the depth of the problem in Myanmar as well. The government of Thailand has known about these concentration camps for years and sort of waits until resentment and public opinion rises to a certain level. We'll go and close up a couple of these concentration camps, round up the people who are running them, arrest them, but very, very few ever go to trial, and even fewer end up being convicted. And so they tend to be released and are free to sort of start this process over again. So the government of Thailand is, again, bordering on complicit with the atrocities going on against the Rohingya right now. As I mentioned, ASEAN as an organization was very slow to react because of their divisions along ideological and religious cleavages. So very little was done about the genocide because ASEAN has a strong norm of not interfering in the internal business of its member states. But following the 2021 coup, they did hold a meeting with the senior general, Min Aung, and outlined a 5-point plan with the goal of reestablishing democracy and ending the genocide. That 5-point plan called for halting all violence, engaging in a constructive dialogue for peace with all parties involved. It said that ASEAN will mediate this dialogue and will provide humanitarian aid, and that it will be especially run by special envoys from ASEAN. Notably, the senior general and the military junta made zero effort to implement any of these 5 points. And as a result of that, the general was not invited to ASEAN's 2021 summit. This might not seem like a big deal, but keep in mind what I said about the importance of gaining legitimacy from international actors for a coup to sort of gain legitimacy. This represented the first time in ASEAN's history, dating back to the 1960s, that a head of state from a member nation was not invited to the summit. So this actually represents some, even if symbolic, pressure on the coup to, or on the junta to sort of lead to more democratization. The junta itself is using violence strategically, playing insurgent groups against each other or ethnic groups against each other, mostly in large part to maintain its control over the jade mining sector. The junta from Myanmar at this point provides over 70% of the world's jade, largely going through China. And that's accounts for over half of Myanmar's GDP, the economic activity that's associated with that. While blood diamonds and other conflict minerals have gained a lot of attention, jade has not. There is rampant corruption in the jade industry. There are, of course, reports that this is not just as a result of Myanmar's companies and mining companies and corporations, but from external actors as well, mostly China, that they are continuing to promote sort of this conflict mining process that does not care about human rights or safe working conditions or anything else at all. It's just about resource extraction. The junta itself is nominally in favor of some democracy. They've sort of rigged the constitution so that democracy can occur, and there will be several like parliamentary seats or governing seats that are reserved for military members. That is sort of a way for them to maintain power. The extensive civil wars in the country, there's sort of a constant push and pull between establishing ceasefires and opening peace talks, and then those eventually falling apart and different insurgent groups entering and exiting and re-entering the civil war against the state. These are largely organized around ethnic groups, both from a race perspective and a religious perspective. In terms of the prospects for peace, I'll start to wrap up here. The international community, both individual states and international organizations, are going to need to apply significantly more pressure to keep the junta from gaining legitimacy. I think increasing the use of election observers and peacekeepers is a big first step here. The UN peacekeeping missions often take a lot of flack for their failures, but they don't get a lot of credit for their successes. There is a way, a path forward where peacekeepers in particular are able to sort of lead to more ceasefires and start to help lower the level of hostilities in the country. And that could lead to a more functioning electoral system, more involvement from different ethnic groups that could then lead to a functioning democracy. Another way of doing this is attempting to integrate these ethnic insurgents as part of the political system and the armed forces. There is some academic research that shows one of the best ways to prevent insurgent groups from rebelling in the future is by giving them jobs and integrating them into the military itself. It helps them stop seeing the state as an enemy, helps increase sort of cohesion, and prevents them from sort of sitting around as former soldiers with nothing to do except looting and turning to organized crime. Longer term, increasing economic interdependence. Post-coup regimes are more likely to be forced to step down if they rely heavily on international trade and have a strong formal economy. So increasing the public economy or the formal sector of the economy and shutting down more of the black market trade and having more contract intensive money, more economic integration with the global system, not just ASEAN and China, I think would be really big steps towards promoting peace there. And those are sort of the big foreign policy things that I could see occurring that might increase the chances of ending the genocide and successful democratization in Myanmar. I think with that, I will stop and open up for questions.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to maybe stop sharing your slideshow? Thank you. And thank you so much for that powerful talk. I don't know about everyone else, but I felt a lot of emotions during that talk, but mostly grateful for being better informed. So thank you for sharing that. I want to remind everyone at this time, if you have questions, you can just pop those in the Q&A and we will get those to Dr. Bagwell to answer. but I'll go ahead and start. We've heard so much about the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine, and there's been such a global outpouring of support for the Ukrainian people. But I feel like we've heard very little about these events in Myanmar. So could you please talk a little bit about why that might be?
I think there's a strong element there of racism. This is a topic that it's in terms of media attention, it's really difficult to avoid. I remember when the Russia-Ukraine crisis was first really kicking off, and there was a BBC reporter that was talking about the refugee crisis, and he referred to refugees from Ukraine as being fairly civilized, and this was meant as a direct contrast to refugees from Syria. Basically, they're European, they're like us, we can successfully integrate them into our communities, whereas, oh no, not those Muslims. We don't want them in our community. And I think that, there is definitely a race element here. I think there's also a religion element here. After 9/11, anti-Muslim sentiment in the West really skyrocketed as part of the war on terror. One of the things that the junta has done a really good job of is trying to frame what they're doing as part of the war on terror to mixed degrees of success, even though the Rohingya themselves are a largely peaceful ethnic group, and were more, when political violence happened, it was more reactive than proactive on the part of the Rohingya. And so I definitely think there is a strong element of anti-Muslim sentiment and race, since it's not a primarily European problem.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me as well, but I wanted to hear your perspective. So we have some questions that are being posted. One from Anthony is, what was the effect of not inviting the general to the ASEAN summit? So was there an impact from that happening?
So we're not likely to see an immediate impact from that happening, but it is something that will continue to limit the degree of legitimacy that the general is able to wield over time. I will say that ASEAN could have gone a step further and invited somebody from the party that won the election to take the general's place. Instead, they ultimately said they were going to find somebody and never bothered to find anybody. So, it was something, but it could have been more.
Okay, we have a couple part question here now. Prior to 2021, consumer pressure led to many outside corporations greatly reducing or eliminating their presence in Myanmar. Did that contribute to the success of the coup? Next part. Post 2021 coup, instability and increased media attention led to even more corporations such as Kirin Holdings leaving. Your lecture indicates it would likely strengthen the junta rather than have the desired consumer effect. Has that been the case? So did corporations leaving strengthen them rather than negatively impact the junta? And how have economic conditions of people been affected?
So I think these are really complex and important questions. On the one hand, sort of sanctions have to be put in place in order for the administration to feel the negative effects, but decreasing the amount of vulnerability that they have to those pressures. At some point you get diminishing returns from these types of actions. So while it is important to note that consumer pressure led to a lot of outside corporations reducing their presence in Myanmar, I don't know that that really contributed to the success of the coup. I think in terms of limiting the likelihood of future coups or promoting democracy in general, economic development is one of the ways to do that. I don't think it would strengthen the junta for more of them to leave, but I think it would weaken the junta if they came back with really stringent conditions on what it was going to take for them to stay. So it's not just do you stay or do you go, it's how you stick around if you're going to stick around.
Thank you. So Dr. Eob wants to thank you for your presentation of a complex issue that needs a global acknowledgement, and asks, how does this case differ from previous situations in Darfur, Sudan, Rwanda? And are there any similarities in the way that global institutions responded to yet another crime against humanity?
I think there are definitely similarities. Dr. Eob, you mentioned Sudan and Rwanda in particular. These were massive failures of the international community, being way too slow to react. That is clearly a similarity. In terms of its other precedents, I think, again, this is, there's an element of geostrategic importance to major foreign policy powers, and again, going back to race and religion, this is a crime being committed against a group that is not seen favorably by the international community, and that is leading on both counts to a lack of attention, a lack of acknowledgement, and a lack of response.
Excellent. Okay, we have another question from Alexander. What is the present state of FDI in Myanmar as it relates to Western investment?
So there, as Rachel mentioned in her question, there has been a significant amount of divestment as it relates to Western investment in particular. Unfortunately, that has created a vacuum where corporations or firms that do not have democratic values or countries that do not have democratic values are able to sort of get their economic hooks in and push for a continued lack of democratization.
I had another question, if that's okay, Stephen. Part of the justification for this most recent coup was allegations of widespread voter fraud. And you talked about that a little bit in your presentation. Certainly, we've heard similar refrains in other countries, including in the United States on the day of the January 6th riots and preceding that. So can you talk a little bit more about the role of allegations of voter frauds in this coup, and maybe if there's other examples you want to pull in as well?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that there were some election observers in the 2021 election in Myanmar, including observers from the Carter Center, which is one of the most reliable election observing organizations in the world. The Carter Center observes elections and monitors for irregularities or lack of transparency in a number of different dimensions. I have a few off the top of my head that I know that they monitored and gave some comments on. They noticed that the election administration itself lacked some transparency in terms of what votes were going to be counted and what votes weren't. Overall, they found the election to be free and fair and of relatively high quality. They noted that the government made several steps towards making this election more legitimate. Voter registration, there was no significant issues with voter registration or irregularities with voter registration. They noted that candidacy was subject to excessive restrictions, specifically related to citizenship, because the government of Myanmar doesn't consider the Rohingya citizens, even though they were born in Myanmar and have been there for generations. That's the same with other ethnic groups as well. So even if voters have choices, they're not given they're not given an unlimited amount of choices, or different candidates are not given fair access. And then finally, they noted that the legal framework, the constitutional framework, needs significant reform. They highlighted the military having seats reserved in the government for themselves as being problematic, and inequality in terms of access in administering the election in different districts was also problematic. So I think overall, the widespread allegations of fraud are definitely fraudulent themselves, but there are always going to be things that they can improve about the administering of the election.
as we've seen in our country and in others, sometimes those facts about the security of the elections don't matter in the face of rhetoric to the contrary.
That's right.
Another thing that I was thinking about is how China and Russia are such strong allies in their own ways and global superpowers. And we've seen how they have interacted around the war in Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe responding to what's happening in Myanmar? You mentioned China a bit. So is Russia and the interaction between Russia and China playing a role in this? Or how is China influencing the situation?
Sure. So I think China definitely has influence. They're one of Myanmar's neighbors. They are probably the economy that Myanmar is most integrated with right now. They are certainly dominant in the region. And there is from some of the reports that I've read, a growing resentment with some of China's dominance of the economy. So there was an illustrative quote in one of the links that Lorna shared that said, one of the hairs on the head of the jade industry is Burmese and all the rest are Chinese. So there is a growing sense from the people of Myanmar that China is continuing to sort of infiltrate the economy and that they are not necessarily pleased with the way that's happening. They are essentially stealing the resources of Myanmar or paying very little for them. And I think if there was more transparency in who owned the different mining corporations, in the relations between the junta and Chinese investors, in a decrease in corruption overall, increase in transparency overall, we would probably see China have significantly less influence. Just to continue the comparison with Russia and Ukraine and China and Myanmar, Russia didn't want to see a thriving democracy on its doorstep, another thriving democracy on its doorstep that was previously sort of dominated by an authoritarian government. China does not want to see strong democratization occur in Myanmar. It would be directly counter to their interests and would sort of contribute to the further spread of democracy in the region. And that's something that China is not interested in seeing.
Thank you. So when we're talking about, these horrific atrocities around the Rohingya, it's upsetting to me. I'm sure it's upsetting to others. You talked a bit about the role that peacekeeping election observers could play. Or I suppose you're thinking the UN has a role there, or is there a role that other international organizations could play to help this situation?
So that's a little bit difficult. It would have to be an organization like the UN, since the regional organization of ASEAN is not going to do it. I think it's difficult because there's been some democratic backsliding in the region, coups in other countries in ASEAN, growing ethno-nationalism in India, which would be the other sort of major influence country in the region other than China. So in terms of, real integration or influence from other countries, unless countries like Australia or New Zealand start to put trade pressure on Myanmar and some of its other trade partners that might end up being sanction busters for any sanctions that do get reimposed following the coup, it seems unlikely short of actual UN intervention.
Thank you. We do have another question here in the chat from Richard. Can you say more about the fighting between the Tatmadaw and other ethnic groups such as the Kachin, also the situation of refugees in Bangladesh?
Sure. So most of the refugees, I'll answer that part of the question first, in Bangladesh are housed in one specific region in Bangladesh. The situation there is not great. It is certainly overwhelmed with refugees, talking about the hundreds of thousands of refugees that have gone there. Many have attempted to leave Bangladesh for Malaysia and other more ethnically Muslim countries. And that's a perilous journey, and it's really difficult for people to make that journey successfully without dying. And so many choose to stay in Bangladesh in really poor living conditions. Not as bad as the concentration camps in Myanmar, but in refugee camps that are already overwhelmed and do not have sufficient resources to ensure healthcare or education or meet the needs of that community. In terms of the other ethnic conflicts, specifically in Kachin state with the Kachin ethnic group, there have been a number of ceasefires and ceasefires falling apart, reintegration of the ethnic group, and then restarting the civil war. It is largely driven by the Kachin Christian ethnic group. Their sort of insurgent group has alternated back and forth between being a legitimate political operation and having a militant wing, and fighting is still ongoing there. There have been about 150,000 people that have been reported as internally displaced persons, and several thousand of those are trying to continue to seek shelter in territory that's controlled by the Kachin, I think, Independence Army, KIA. The Kachins are currently the major target for the Burmese government or for the government of Myanmar, because so few of the Rohingya ethnic group are continuing to function outside of the concentration camps. So this is sort of like the next, it seems to be the next stage of the genocide and sort of the total societal control from this militant strain of Buddhism.
Thank you for writing a very thorough answer there. It looks like I think we might have another question here in the Q&A. So Rachel has another question. Myanmar has a large number of agricultural dependent households, as much as 70%. However, their overall productions measured in total exports or productivity per acre has been in steady decline since the 1930s, in contrast to conditions elsewhere. Any government that seeks to replace the junta would need to address this concern, but it's a condition that requires a large time commitment to correct. You mentioned that the coup governments often only have around 3 years in power. Are there conditions that have helped allow the time needed for stabilization in other countries that might be successful for this in Myanmar? So are there conditions that could help to stabilize?
That's a great question. And I don't know a lot about agricultural productivity. Rachel is my resident expert in class on agriculture and agricultural policy. So I would probably turn to her to answer that question. I think so. One of the key pillars of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is ensuring agricultural productivity, trying to set a common market for agricultural goods and production. I think if the coup government is not able to get ASEAN's cooperation, this is an area where ASEAN could continue to apply some pressure in terms of aiding the agricultural sector, and ensure that might help ensure another coup doesn't immediately happen afterwards. That's probably going to be the best I'm able to do. Sorry, Rachel.
No, that was good. Rachel's also in my class studying agricultural policy. So thanks for that, Rachel. And if anyone else has any questions, please throw those in the Q&A. I will ask, are there things that you think even acting outside of international organizations, the US government, or even individual US citizens could be doing to help support the people?
So I think supporting organizations that are going to continue to monitor and raise awareness of the situation are really important. Organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International organizations that monitor the working conditions of people in the jade mines. Anything we can do to support those organizations, whether that's donations or making sure that we're only buying products that have jade in them that have been verified as sort of clean. That's really important. That's going to be the most sort of direct thing I think we can do. I think keeping it as part of the conversation is really important. Global change doesn't happen without global awareness. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind. Sort of the last thing to keep in mind is the role that sanctions busters have to play in this. So even if there was a very successful embargo on jade from Myanmar, as long as that's being smuggled over the border into China and then China is selling it on the global market, that just creates an additional hurdle for holding people accountable. And so I think we need to try to set up or support systems that prevent sanctions busting, prevent sanctions busting from happening, making sure that we're really verifying where products are coming from and what the labor standards of those supply chains are, which is something that's really difficult to do, but something that's worth the effort.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And thank you for a very compelling presentation and a super dynamic, informative Q&A. And thanks to everyone in the audience for your participation. We hope you can join us for the next Great Decision Speaker Series event on Biden's agenda. That's May 5th at 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. And I will actually be the speaker for that event, where we will look at some of the promises Biden made to reverse policies of the past administration and how he's actually responding to things like the pandemic and immigration, and other issues related to U.S. foreign policy. So we'll talk more about that on May 5th. There's a link in the chat if you're interested in registering for that event. Again, these quality programs can only happen because of the support of our membership. So please become a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis today. I think that Bob is going to